I knew a lot about the beefs and the scandals of Hollywood just from being a fan of that. I knew the movies, but I went in and I looked at menus. I looked at menus of the time period. What were they eating? Where were they dining? Memoirs. And memoirs often have a lot of this detail. I think the gold flakes, I got it from Tallulah Bankhead. That's what she smoked.
Library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I was thinking earlier in the day about why I enjoy doing these kinds of events so much. And I work at home alone writing, and I didn't do an MFA. I'm not in writers groups or anything like this. And so it's such a privilege and an honor to come and talk to a writer like Sylvia, whose work I've been combing through in preparation for this. And I'm so impressed with, and I hope you'll join me. And I have so many questions, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions too. So this is going to be hopefully a lively conversation, and we can follow our curiosity. So we'll start with about 45 minutes between Sylvia and I, and we'll then talk a bit about the book. Sylvia's going to then do a short reading. Then I wanted to zoom out a little bit and talk about Sylvia's writing life and her process and that sort of thing. And then we'll turn over to your questions at about, what time is it now? So about 7:45. So be thinking about that as we talk and get your questions ready. And then Sylvia will be signing books.
Yes.
So, without further ado, so this book, I was just saying to Sylvia that I started it right after the presidential election in the U.S., and I was feeling a little flat, I guess, and I don't know if anyone else had this response, but I was having a little trouble reading and getting into things, sort of, getting myself out into the news and other things. But this book was the answer. It's such a brilliant, right from the first page, I knew I was in the hands of an expert storyteller. There's big characters, big story. And I knew I was going to get swept away. It's set in 1950s Hollywood. The Sword and Sandals, as movies are big, and the studio system is large and in charge, but changing. There's a big budget movie being filmed called The Seventh Veil of Salome, and all the actresses in Hollywood want to be in this film. The person who's cast is Vera. She's sort of our heroine. She is our heroine. She's an unknown Mexican actress who's new to the scene in Hollywood. There's also a character named Nancy Hartley, who's a more seasoned actress, but maybe on the downturn of her career that never quite went up. And she doesn't get the role. She gets a bit part, but she feels she deserved the role. So that's sort of the scene. And then there's this is the story of those two women, and then Salome, which is, she's the daughter of Herod II.
Yeah, one of the many Herods.
Yeah. I always get my Herods mixed up. So that story moves alongside the other two women. So we pull, and her story is very much, you call it the tangled knots of kin that she has, which is, again, another epic. But as I was reading this, so I was in 1950s Hollywood, and then I'd be, immersed in the dusty sandals. But it's described as a story told in Technicolor, and I think that's exactly it. You feel like you're in these big sets and in these scenes. But it also, so it's written in the past, but it also feels like it's written to us now. There's so many things in this book that speak to our times. And that was one of the things that I really want to talk about tonight. So I think I'd like to start, Sylvia, by asking you about Salome and how you first got interested in her as a figure. In your author's note, you mentioned that her story has been painted in paintings, in literature, and in music. And in a way, your book's adding to her story. So, yes, so how you got interested in her, I'd love to hear about that.
There was a painting by Gustave Moreau. Gustave Moreau painted a multitude of Salomes, but I saw one of the Salomes that he painted, and I found it very interesting. I don't remember how many sketches or drawings he did, dozens of this biblical theme. And when I was thinking of doing something that riffed off a biblical story, I landed in Salome, I believe because she is such a mutable kind of character. In the Bible, you read Judith, and Judith is the heroine.
Right.
She cuts off the head of Holofernes, so she's a good girl. And then you've got somebody like Delilah. She betrays Samson, cuts off his hair for a bunch of silver, sells him off. So she's the bad girl.
Right.
And then you've got Salome, who is an incredibly minor figure in the Bible. She doesn't even get a name. She's just mentioned in passing. And I think because of that, because she's incredibly minor, because her story is kind of constructed after the fact, there are a multitude of Salomes that appear throughout time. So you see representations of Salome shifting and changing. You've got all the paintings of Salome, but then you eventually have poetry, you have stories. You've got Oscar Wilde and his play Salome, where he comes up with the idea of the dance of the seven veils.
Right.
Eventually, you've got Salome, the opera, and then Salome comes in the then new medium of film, first in silent film, then in Technicolor, and so on and so forth. So there's always Salomes throughout culture, and what I found interesting about it is how Salome shifts and is, good, bad, and so I wanted to kind of look at that character for that reason, I think, because with other heroines of the Bible, I know how I'm supposed to take them.
Right.
Salome, it was just a big question mark in a way. Yeah.
And that's for you. I think you're a very ambitious writer. You go for big stories. Mm-hmm. And so for you, I think for other people that would be intimidating, but for you, that's what attracts you. Is it?
Yeah. I thought it was like tasty.
Yeah, exactly. That I feel that's through all your books. Tasty is a great way to put it. And so you were writing about the Herodian dynasty. How did you you have so much rich period detail. How did you research for that bit?
Yeah, so I read a book that talked about the Herodian dynasty, all the Herods, the multitude of Herods that I mentioned. Everybody's named Herod, so it's very confusing, Herod the Great, then Herod has multiple sons named Herod, and, so there's and then Herodias, who is the mother of, possibly the mother of Salome, because since she's not named in the Bible, we're not sure if that Salome is the Salome who asked for the head of John the Baptist in the story in the Bible. But so there's that, and I was reading also about the time period of when this is happening, the Roman Empire, its influence in this part of the world, how basically at this point in time, Herod is a bit of a puppet king. He's reigning, but he's really reigning for Rome, kind of like. So I was looking at all that real historical detail, but at the same time, I think what I wanted to evoke in the book was the feeling that I got when I watched movies in Mexico when I was a child, and we had Semana Santa, Holy Week, and they would have all the ancient world movies on that week. They would have, obviously, the Ten Commandments and stuff like that, but they would also have other stuff that was Cleopatra and Samson and Delilah and other things, and they would show them kind of in marathon, and they were these, like, big Technicolor productions, and there was a sense of, I call it the fantastic but not fantasy, these movies, because they're not fantasy in the sense that fantasy, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones kind of stuff, but there is a sense of the fantastic because there's an implausibility, an impossibility happening with these films. You've got all these British actors talking and being kings in Egypt and Roman generals. You've got all these men and women dressed in anachronistic styles with showing a lot of cleavage or things that are like they wouldn't have been doing that. And the colors are so bright because of the Technicolor. They're impossible colors you don't see anymore on film. And the extras and all the big production values that they have are things that you also don't see on film anymore. I mean, I know Gladiator 2 is right now in cinemas, which is kind of like the grandchild of those kinds of films. And yet it doesn't have, I think, that same sense of scale, because back then what they used to do is whether they were filming in Italy, where there was the cheaper sword and sandal films that were happening, or in the States, you had to get a crowd of hundreds of actors in there, dressed all in Roman garb to do this scene. So there was this lushness, and so what I wanted to get in the scenes where we are at the court of King Herod is not necessarily something that is 100% true to life, because I changed some relationships around to make it, some names to make it easier, so that not everybody's called Herod, and some things didn't quite happen that way, obviously, because we don't have record of what Salome was doing or thinking at the time, so it's it's an exercise in the imagination. But I wanted it to feel both plausible, like you thought, I can see how it could have been that way, but also to have that sense of but at the same time we're in a movie in the realm of the fantastic, where these things are kind of very theatrical and happening in a way that you don't really encounter in the historical record. You encounter them in Hollywood, that sense of awe of the past, but seen through the lens of Hollywood, is something that I wanted to do. So there was research done. At one point, I was I told the copy editor, no, I forgot to say that back then you didn't have, it was a hyposandal is what they call, what the horse would wear. Oh, yeah. And so I had made a mistake, and I didn't call it that, and so I was like, you have to put hyposandal in there, because that's what the Romans would have called it. And we did, and so I wanted to get some of those details right to make you feel, but at the same time, I want you to make you feel really like you're being transported a bit into this realm of Hollywood magic in a way.
Oh, neat. Okay. Because in the 1950s Hollywood, it really struck me that there was all these tiny details that made it feel so authentic. So what was it? It was things like the brand of cigarettes, English Gold Flakes.
English Gold Flakes.
And or one of the characters would say, "Oh, baloney." Or so how did you find those?
I read. I love all Hollywood, so this is coming from somebody who kind of breakfasted on that since she was a child. Yeah. But I knew a lot about the beefs and the scandals of Hollywood just from being a fan of that. I knew the movies, but I went in and I looked at menus. I looked at menus of the time period. What were they eating? Where were they dining? Memoirs. And memoirs often have a lot of this detail. I think the Gold Flakes, I got it from Tallulah Bankhead. That's what she smoked. So I read biographies of Rita Moreno, who was a Puerto Rican actress in the time period, but I also read stuff about Kirk Douglas, all those kinds of performers, what it would have been like. I read what the actor's studio was like in this time period and the people that were there versus kind of the more Hollywood stuff. That was really fun. I watched a lot of old movies, some that I had seen before, others that I hadn't seen. I think the funnest part was looking at the screen tests for actors, when they're going for a part. So I got to see James Dean when he was doing his screen test for his first big role, and he's there and you see the chemistry with the other actors. And so that's really fun. And one of the most haunting things was when I was looking at some screen tests, and often they didn't record the audio because it was not necessary. It was a test. So you see them and you see these people laughing and chatting, but there's no sound. It's lost. It's just their image is there forever preserved, but their words are gone. So I thought that was kind of sad and haunting too.
And a lot of, you show Hollywood, I wouldn't say it's raw, but you get a very realistic sense of all the politics and so much of that comes through. I think of Vera especially in that. So she's the newcomer to the Hollywood scene. She hasn't been in a movie before, and she's got this huge starring role. And so much of her journey, I suppose, is trying to reconcile who she's supposed to play in the film, who she feels like she is inside, who she feels like she is at home. And it's really the story of her bringing those together. Did you have an inspiration for her? How did you? She's such a complex character.
I leaned a lot on Rita Moreno for Vera and some other Latin American performers and what it was like in Latin Hollywood in that time period, which was kind of very different from kind of the other type of Hollywood that you had, and some of the difficulties that the actors faced. So there's kind of like two types of actors in Hollywood. There's the people who very quickly make it to the top. They come out of nowhere, even nowadays, but especially in those days, it's like you could be like washing cars and somebody saw you and say, you're gonna be a star kid, and you were kind of like, that happened to a number of actors or actresses. Audrey Hepburn was sitting in the lobby of a hotel, and she was cast to play the lady in Gigi, which was a play,
right.
And after that, she did Roman Holiday, and she was a star. She didn't have to do all the years of lessons in tap dancing and all this kind of stuff. And there were people, on the other hand, who hung out for years and years trying to get a break in Hollywood, and then they never made it. They're like these obscure kind of footnotes in history that you wouldn't know about unless you're like really specialized. And so it was very interesting to see both of these kinds of actors and what happens when you go one route or when you go sort of the other. And some of those stories are very tragic because some people really end up in very bad places. The first Superman, I think his last name was Reeves, on TV, he had that show, and then he couldn't really do anything with the Superman role. People would laugh at him when they would see him in other stuff and movies, so he didn't really have much of a chance to develop a career. Died young, either suicide or maybe a murder. One of those big mysteries of Hollywood, what happened to him kind of situation. But then you have people who were extremely successful, like Marilyn Monroe, and also did not come to a good, happy end, had a lot of troubles and difficulties. So it's a tough business. I mean, it's a really competitive, tough business, and there's all these things that make people sometimes be very vulnerable.
There was this beautiful moment where Nancy, who's the struggling actress, she looks into a mirror and she says, the woman who stared back at her was Salome. If she could be seen like this, the world would be hers. And it's sort of Nancy seeing herself as Vera, who is cast in this role. And Vera is having a hard time and has all these expectations and is experiencing racism and not being allowed to develop creatively. And so Vera in turn is projecting herself and trying to be Salome. So it's like these three women sort of chasing something that isn't ultimately there. It's a myth, isn't it? And it's a book a bit about that, about how these women are constructed into myths. And I guess I would love to hear you talk a bit about that too, and where your interest in that comes from.
Talking about Marilyn Monroe kind of struggled with that. She liked to read a lot. She was kind of bookish naturally, and wanted to be taken seriously as an actress, and it kind of didn't really happen for her. So I think it was this frustration of not being seen as herself, being the character of Marilyn. And Rita Hayworth also talked about that. She said that a lot of men were interested in her because she did Gilda, and that was a very sexy character. And so she complained that men were disappointed because they went to sleep with Gilda, but they woke up with Rita Hayworth in the morning, and she was not as cool
Right.
as a character. So there's some of that, like Hollywood. Obviously, it's constructing these myths. It's making people up in many different kinds of ways. Sometimes it's constructing the myths to make somebody more sellable, and sometimes it's constructing the myths to obscure reality. So all the gay and lesbian actors, obviously they're being like, no, you cannot, like nobody can know about this. Rock Hudson, I remember when it came out that he died of AIDS and that he was a gay man. My grandmother was like, Rock Hudson was gay, but he was a heartthrob, so manly, such, like a lover of women. And it's like, well, of course, because Hollywood kind of like made him seem like that, like he was like this, like, oh, macho heterosexual guy, married him off to a secretary to kind of quiet rumors of like, this is a gay man kind of situation. And same thing, Anthony Perkins and some other performers. It's like, so it created these fantasies of people, and I think it's sometimes it's really tough to live up to the fantasy. Pamela Anderson has a new movie coming out. It's called The Last Showgirl. It's set in Vegas, and she's been giving interviews, and she's been talking about how she feels that this has been a movie that it's taken her whole life to make, because she just hasn't been given the opportunity to do something else. I mean, I remember Pamela as the Baywatch kind of girl, and the jokes about her and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, she's a very, I think, well-known figure from the 1990s, and probably a very wealthy and established woman, I hope, after all that work. At the same time, it is kind of sad that, it took her all these years to get the role that she wanted.
Yeah.
The thing that she really wanted. Demi Moore also did The Substance recently, and it's good to see her working and kind of like in the limelight again. But at the same time, I mean, those years when she couldn't really find work or do work because people were telling her, you're too old, Demi, you're past your prime, like that must have been really very difficult. So there's that kind of stuff of, I think, Hollywood creates myths, but then it's difficult to live up to those expectations.
Yeah, and this story is so much of Vera's struggle and her trying to find a creative voice.
Yeah.
Would you like to do a short reading from the book? I'd
Sure.
love, I hope everyone agrees with this. I love hearing the words in the author's voice, and it'll give us a little taste too.
Okay,
That'd
yeah.
be great.
I'll do that. I'm not reading my emails, I'm reading the book.
Just sending a few text messages if you.
Yeah, I find as I get older, it's better to read ebooks because I can make the font
Yeah.
big. Like, woo. Yeah. So, Joe Cantor. I'd spent most of the day tucked away at the Musso and Front Grill on Hollywood Boulevard, working through a pile of notes. Its high-backed, padded red leather boots were the perfect hiding spot for harried writers trying to clobber their way through script changes. And boy, did I have script changes. Some folks called Max Neiman a bully, and others called him a genius. I called him an obsessive workaholic. I was laboring on yet another draft of The Seventh Veil of Salome, and I was the third writer that Neiman had hired. His propensity for new notes was enough to send any scribe howling out the door, but I didn't mind him. Previously, I'd done work for other directors of note. Howard Hawks, who liked to mutter disparaging comments about Jews, and I'd had to stomach Michael Curtis's creative barrage of hyphenated insults. No good son of a bitch, ad nauseum. Neiman didn't think highly enough of writers to abuse them, reserving his barbs for his actors and assistants. So I was in a relatively serene state of mind. After a couple of whiskey sours and a plate of grilled lamb kidneys, I tucked my portable Smith Corona Sterling into its case and headed back to the studio to deliver the pages. Neiman had been asking about. Pacific Pictures was a mid-sized player. The gorillas in the business were MGM, Paramount Pictures, 20th Century Fox, and Warner Brothers, the crown jewels of Hollywood. Then you had RKO, Universal, Columbia, and of course, Pacific Pictures. We were not providers of Poverty Row fare like Grand National, but we didn't have MGM's dazzling facilities either. We made a heck of a lot of mindless comedies, our share of corny romances and dramas, and a couple of big-budget opuses each year, just as you'd expect, like clockwork. Things were changing, though, in more than one way around town. The antitrust case against the majors dealt a blow to the mega studios, and TV was picking up speed and viewers. Charlie Chaplin sold his studio at La Brea after being declared persona non grata in the US, and a bunch of writers decamped to Mexico for fear of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. I'd stayed put. The committee had lots of us spooked, but I needed the work, and work meant living in Hollywood. So anyway, that's what your documentary is about, I know. Salome. Let's talk about her. Among all this hustle and bustle, there was Neiman's elusive Seventh Veil of Salome. It was one of those sword and sandal flicks that were terribly popular back in the day. You were not a real studio if every couple of years you didn't have at least one picture with a camel, a palace, and a garbage plot thinly inspired by a biblical story. Hedy Lamarr squeezed the biceps of Victor Mature in Samson and Delilah. Gregory Peck romanced Susan Hayward in David and Bathsheba. And now it was Neiman's, and my turn, to make more meat for the masses, like an employee stuffing sausages for the Hebrew National Kosher Sausage Factory, except when you worked there, you got to eat a tasty sausage and you didn't have to worry about evading a code administrator eager to mark every other page as objectionable. Neiman's project had been in the works forever, and Frank Dressler was breathing down his neck. They'd start shooting soon, no doubt about it, and if the studio was lucky, Neiman wouldn't return with a 3-hour monstrosity. Neiman was good, but he was stubborn, and we were already making bets on how far behind the production would fall once it began what was sure to be, at minimum, a 90-day shoot. At the lot, I ran into Harry Merriam, who was a serviceable writer of women's pictures and a prodigious gossip. He pulled me aside and told me that Neiman had tested a girl and finally found his Salome. Absolutely, and I'm Burt Lancaster, I said. Neiman had screen tested every actress in town for more than a year and hadn't signed anyone. Word was the screen tests were a publicity stunt, and he was biding his time, desperately trying to get his hands on Jane Russell, but the sexy brunette wasn't biting. She was finishing a stint at RKO. She'd just done an adventure flick for them, Underwater, which had sailed into rough seas after a model called Glenn Jones sued the company for using her as an uncredited body double in the publicity pictures. Then, at the premiere for Underwater, which took place in a swimming pool, Jane Mansfield's bikini top had popped off. A neat trick that soon became a regular occurrence with Jane. Jane Russell was probably fed up with gimmicky flicks like that and likely suspected the Seventh Veil of Salome was another silly gimmick. Anyhow, no Russell and no Mansfield had been signed, but that wasn't my business. "The girl's a nobody," Harry said. "Now I know it's a lie," I replied. If Neiman couldn't snatch a bona fide star, surely he'd avail himself of a semi-famous starlet or a pretty pinup. There were heaps of girls itching to get a crack at films. Mac's not going to have a nobody anchor his flick, and even if he wanted to, Dresser won't let him. They'll grab a cheap, reliable contract player. Mark my words. "You haven't seen her. She's a real peach of a girl. They're giving her a tour of the studio." "Fakakta," I said, and took out a cigarette, and then, just as we were beginning to talk about other business, Harry pointed excitedly to the building in front of us. "There she is. That's the girl. That's Salome." She was wearing a simple yellow sundress and sandals, and her hair hung loose down her back. She had a nice figure, but so did many budding stars, often with the help of strategic padding. She had a pretty face, but a good makeup artist can make a siren out of a dumpy librarian. A certain elegance in the walk elevated her a tad, perhaps, but that can be learned. The pouty, kissable mouth was a delightful touch, and yet I wasn't convinced I'd have chosen her picture from a stack of glossies. And then the girl looked at us as if sensing our gaze, her wide eyes locking with mine for 1 second before she looked away, a nervous, hesitant smile dancing on her lips. Shyness warring with delight, with pride, poise and caution in the turn of the head. Charming. But more than that, it was the gesture, the look of the character as I'd imagined her. Temptress and bestial maiden in one. As you write a story, you hope for the best when it comes to casting. Sometimes actors are close to the mark, and often they're far from what you pictured when building the part. This, however, was the first time I'd seen a character I'd been working on drift off the page and into a studio lot, breathing, walking, living. I immediately saw what the casting director must have glimpsed, the luscious, exciting possibilities that lay ahead. The girl, straddled in silks and sequins, set against exotic vistas and sand dunes, with dramatic music punctuating her entrance. That minuscule tilt of the head, the long fingers brushing away a rogue strand of hair from her face. During a close-up, the viewers would swoon. But even as she stood there in a sundress with a flower print, with nothing but the California sun to light her face, the truth was plain to see. This, there was no denying, was Salome in the flesh. It's a tragedy what befell her. How do you tell a tragedy anyway? For all the artistic tricks a writer can deploy, I suppose the only way to do it is you start by saying, there once was a girl. So that's it.
I loved hearing that because you just changed. Wasn't that a bit, I often try and explain that writing is a bit like acting. And this book especially is told in all sorts of different voices. Yeah. And what makes it so spectacular to read is the voices are so clearly embodied and very distinct from each other. So it was neat to see even your posture changed there. Yeah, that was good. Okay, so where's my Taylor Jenkins Reid? She wrote Daisy Jones and the Six. She said about your work, and I love this, her genres are ever changing. You never know what she's going to do, but you know it will be a page turner. I love that, because I think that's quite right. When I picked this book up, I was like, this looks like a romance. What? And it is, but you play with genres so much. So I'd love to talk a bit about your writing life and how you come up with your ideas and that sort of thing. So I was reading This Strange Way of Dying, which is your first collection. It came out in 2013 with Exile Editions. And what really struck me about that is how your voice was there, how well formed it is. And there was a story in particular called The Death Collector, which caught my attention because it was 1960s Hollywood, but it had a lot of the same preoccupations. So do you know what I mean by that? Like, I feel like you were a storyteller right from the start. So how did you get your start, I guess is what I want to know. And have you always written? Are you one of those people that have always been secretly?
Yeah.
I can tell
since
that.
I was a kid.
Yeah,
since I was a kid. But I talk about, I was writing since I was a kid, but I started writing in 2006. And I know that sounds like it's contradictory, because how can you start writing when you can? Because 2006 is when I really started writing. It was my mature writing, when I started finding who I was as a writer. Before that, I had a great love of fantasy and science fiction and horror. My mother had a lot of those types of books at home, so I read them. I read Stephen King, and I read The Lord of the Rings, and I read Dune, that kind of stuff. I loved it. I wanted to do that kind of writing. And so I was writing stories in which these bunch of white guys were drinking ale in a tavern, and they were all British. And I had never been to a tavern. I did not know what ale was, and I had never met a British person in my life. So the result was that it was like a body that has no internal organs.
Right. Oh,
right?
Yeah.
It was like there's the outside, but you poke at it, there's nothing inside. I didn't know that at the time, but I could feel it for many years. For a long time, I knew that there was something wrong with my writing. And I think it was in 2006, around that time, I had moved to Canada. I had emigrated there, so I was living there. And I think part of it was nostalgia. I was just thinking about home a lot. I mean, what used to be my home, about Mexico. And often when you are living somewhere, being in a certain time and place, you don't appreciate its uniqueness, what it is. You just think every place is like this, right? boring street, boring people, boring neighborhood or town or whatever. I lived in a big city, but, boring neighborhood. And, but after going away for a while, and I was thinking about my family, our stories, the stories my great-grandmother told me when I was growing up, my neighborhood where I used to live. And I think I began to appreciate them. You often don't know what you have until, it's gone. And in appreciating it and looking back and finding the value in it, it's when I began to be able to write better, or to write something that actually had organs inside of it, because I was drawing from that to construct my stories. But it took that, I think, kind of like walking away and turning back and finding your own past valuable to begin to write seriously.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And in that, the bio of that book, you're described as Mexican by birth and Canadian by inclination.
Yes, I think it's the
Do you
most
stand by
accurate
that?
description. Yeah. I hate it when people call me American when they don't know, and I'm like, no, I am not American. I'm not from the United States. Yeah. I think that's. I like to say that because I think it makes it more clear. Sometimes when people do the hyphenated thing, Mexican Canadian, they think I was born and grew up in Canada, and I have maybe Mexican ancestry, but I grew up in Mexico. I left in my 20s. Spanish is my first language, and so I have that strong relationship with my country of birth. But now I have also a strong relationship with my adoptive country where I moved, and I moved by choice, which I think is also an important distinction to make. Like I made this choice. I found something in Canada that I thought was interesting and unique, and I wanted to know Canada better. Some people don't have that choice, right?
Yeah. So Mexican Gothic, it's often called Gothic horror, I guess, is a sort of, and it was in Canada Reads.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and how was that? I wanted to hear about that experience, because that was a big deal.
Yeah, that was weird. I mean, I like Canada Reads. There's nothing quite like it, I think, in the U.S. where they have a whole contest for books. Let's call it like that.
Does everyone know, like
right?
on the CBC,
Yeah,
you
on the
listen to
CBC.
Canada Reads? Yeah. So it was 2023, I think?
Yeah,
Mexican
yeah,
Gothic?
yeah. It was very fun. I really liked the person who was championing, was a very young, active, dedicated person who's on TikTok. I'm not, but she was, and so she understands that world of readers and all that kind of stuff. It was very fun talking to the other writers on it when we were able to do like an event together. And it was also the first time that I went into bookstores and I could find my book easily in Canada. It was weird because normally I sometimes go even to like the bookstore that's in my neighborhood and they don't have my stuff sometimes, the traders.
But then this book was like, isn't it the Good Morning America
Yeah, it
book?
was,
So
it was
you're
a Good
like
Morning
all over
America book.
morning television
So
in the
so then I
US.
got to be in morning television in the U.S. Yeah. But here, like CBC, like that kind of contest, it's a big deal. Like all of us, we would all go into the stores and our books would be like right there at the entrance, and it's not something that you get every day as a writer in your life.
Not.
So it was like, and I think it was the first time a graphic novel won. The winner of that
right.
year,
Yeah.
Ducks. That was pretty cute.
That is a good book.
Yeah.
So why do you think you write, fundamentally?
It's obsessive compulsive behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could be doing a lot worse things, so it's not not the worst option in the world. But yeah, no, I had surgery this summer, and so I was recovering from it. They gave me painkillers, and I was in bed, and I couldn't get to the computer, right? And I woke up, and I had a weird dream because of the painkillers. Not like super weird, just kind of a little bit odd. And I was like, I want to write something about this, but I couldn't sit down and do the work, so I wrote it on my cell phone, kind of like, and then I finished it, and I was sending it to an anthology to a friend that had that had asked me about it. I had a certain deadline. I had worked on this before, but I threw away the draft that I had done. I wrote something completely different while I was recovering. And then I did tell him, you have to be careful because for part of that I was drugged. So there might be some spelling mistakes. But no, he said it was really very clean. Very
In your
clean,
phone.
very clean story.
Oh
but I
my
was on my
gosh.
phone. I just, it's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write, you
Right.
know? Like, it was this drive. After a while, I was just, like, it was boring. I was like, my mother was very kind. She was like, I can put on the TV. I don't like watching TV, which my husband says never tell anybody that. They'll think you're a snob. But I don't. I like watching movies, not TV shows. But she had, like, I don't know, Apple TV or something, and she's like, look at all these wonderful TV shows. And I was like, I don't want to watch them. And she doesn't have TCM.
Right.
So she was like, but I can put the Amazon Prime. I'm like, I don't want it. And after a while, it was like, read or write. And holding the book was kind of tiring at that point. So I was like, with one finger, like, and then, the little bear went to the forest kind of situation.
So do you write every day? Is it?
Not every day, but I really try to write
Yeah.
regularly so that I'm making progress. But I do try to do work every day. And sometimes the work is fairly mundane sounding, like check your emails and reply to them sort of
Yeah.
situation. And sometimes it is just
Do you write by longhand or?
No, I don't.
okay.
I'm dyslexic, so if I wrote by longhand, I would never end. But my notes are sometimes in
Yeah.
cursive, yeah. But the final, like the actual thing, no. Yeah, but the notes don't matter because they're generally very short. They're like, person dies, So if it was more than that, there was a writer, I don't know who she is, somebody told me that she writes the first draft by hand, and then she burns it and writes it again.
A good
Which
ritual,
to me,
a good ritual.
which to me, I could not be able to do that,
I think everyone probably just went, wait, what? You're dyslexic?
Yeah.
So is my son.
I also have Rothicism. It's an inability to roll the letter R. It's a hilarious thing when you speak Spanish. So it takes me a while. And I met somebody, I now know a couple of people who told me they have it too. So I don't feel so alone in the world.
Right,
but
right,
as
right.
a child,
Yeah.
the bullying was just great.
And the computer, though, means that you can write, with it.
Yeah, I don't know why I don't make those mistakes when I'm typing, but I do make them when I'm writing by hand. And I just, I find it very taxing to make the shapes. My eldest child is autistic, and they had the same kind of problem with handwriting. So I think it's maybe something related to that.
Right.
But back in my day, I mean, my diagnosis was basically your child is stupid.
Yeah, yes.
that was it. And the solution for it literally in the parent-teacher meeting was like, I don't know.
Yeah. Yes. In some places, I don't think it's changed that much, but some places it really has too,
It
hasn't
has,
it?
it
Yeah,
has, yeah.